does economics explain capitalism? That's a very interesting question. Of course, it depends entirely on how you define capitalism. There are many, many definitions and many, many varieties of capitalism. So I think that's a question which is almost impossible to answer. But let's think of capitalism, at least sort of as a first start, as a system in which basically most of the means of production and most of the wealth and so forth are controlled by the private sector, and the state is there to provide some underlying services. And then we are told the markets will, of course, take care of all the everything that happens in between. Now, the problem is that, first of all, this whole idea is based on the fact that some people will own the capital, they will invest it, that will produce the goods which the people who consume it will need, and so forth. But that system has many, many defects, as most people now know. And the system depends on the fact that somehow the invisible hand that Adam Smith talked about says, if we leave people to their own devices, then the invisible hand will arrange for a situation which is socially satisfactory. But socially satisfactory, the only definition that we came up with was Pareto's definition, which said, yeah, a situation is socially satisfactory if we cannot make somebody better off without making somebody else worse off. But the problem is there are many socially satisfactory situations in which that doesn't make a lot of sense. Think of a situation in which one person owns everything. And then you would say, well, of course, that's a socially satisfactory situation, because if we take something away from him, he'll be worse off. So to make anybody better off, we would have to make him worse off. But none of us, I think, would agree that that was a satisfactory definition. The problem with, as I said, there's many definitions of capitalism, but if you think of it as being private ownership essentially of the productive means in society, then we live in a situation which is at least partially capitalist. But we should also remember that the state, in fact, plays a huge role. And people don't want to acknowledge that. And the ultra-libertarians don't want the state to play a huge role, except when we get into a crisis. Then they suddenly say, but the state must come to the rescue. The state must bail out the banks and so forth. But in general, they think that the state should not interfere, and they do everything they can to stop it interfering. And I think that is an unfortunate part of our current situation. But then we're told, you ask, what is this invisible hand? How does it work? How will it get us back into a socially satisfactory situation? How does the private ownership of capital do that? And then people will say to you, oh, but it's the markets. Markets do that. And you say, okay, can you explain to me how markets get you from a situation which might not be in a socially satisfactory state into one? How do markets do that? And then, well, as Douglas North, who got a Nobel Prize in economics for studying institutions, said, it's an astonishing part of economic theory that markets play so little role. In other words, we don't actually study how markets work. Most economists are not really interested in the nitty-gritty of how markets work. So they can't really explain to you how markets solve the problem. And the invisible hand, which is supposed to say how capitalism or some other system actually guides us towards some sort of socially satisfactory situation, we can't actually explain that. And in fact, theoretically, given our assumptions about how people are motivated and so forth, we can actually show that you can't explain how an economy would get from a situation which is unsatisfactory to one that's satisfactory. So capitalism was supposed to be the sort of counterpart of liberal democracy. The two things are always thought of as somehow going together. But in fact, capitalism has changed in nature a lot. A huge concentration now of wealth in the hands of very few people. Competition is largely an illusion nowadays. So much concentration in various industries that there's very little competition in the real sense. And Martin Wolf from the Financial Times once said, we have far too little competition in areas where we should have competition, and far too much in areas where you don't need it. And there are many, many parts of our society where what we need is a cooperative, not competitive approach, where we need people to get together to do things, and many other parts where there should be competition and there isn't, because we allow concentration of wealth in so few hands. So we have this unsatisfactory situation that capitalism, as it stands, has led us into a situation where some people have a lot of the wealth, but they decide what they're going to do with it, and there are very few of them. And in addition, the state's role is constantly denigrated and criticized as being unsatisfactory, inefficient, and so forth. So Mariana Mazzucato, who wrote a wonderful book called The Entrepreneurial State, pointed out that the state actually does a lot of the entrepreneurship and can do a great deal to get us into a socially satisfactory situation. But capitalism left to itself, what was it that Kipling said, like nature, red in blood and tooth and claw. So this sort of aggressive competition which leads us to a socially satisfactory situation simply is not a description of what actually goes on. And I think capitalism as it is will, and many people recognize this, it cannot continue. It doesn't organize itself into a socially satisfactory situation. The COVID problem is a real illustration of that. So think of this organism, this huge organism, the socio-economic system, and think what happens. It's hit by something like the pandemic. What immediately happens is that certain things start to really work rather badly. And at that point, the organism tries to rush resources to those parts of the organism that's not doing well, and as if it had a disease which has to be cured. But unfortunately, what also happens is that this reveals other problems. Let me give you a very stupid and simple example, which is that with the arrival of COVID and with the confinement measures in different countries, the delivery of goods like food and so forth to people's houses by things like Uber accelerated. A huge amount of resources suddenly went into people delivering these goods. But the people who deliver those goods have a very poorly paid and often very unstable jobs. And so they start to react. They say, well, you know, why should we, when we are essential in this new system, why should we have to work for so little when we're doing an essential job? And then that starts to unwind, and this sort of gig economy which has suddenly expanded, people are unhappy with doing that job, and we shouldn't be dependent on sort of little people who suddenly have to deliver to everybody. Our system should be sufficiently resilient that we could actually prepare for this and make sure that people had the basic necessities. And this is not a left-wing idea, you know, this is like universal health care. So why is that not, why should that not be part of a capitalist economy? There's no reason that the United States, the wealthiest country in the world, cannot even provide universal health care for all its members. This just doesn't seem reasonable. Is the United States poorer in some sense than Denmark? If we had universal health care in many countries, it would have helped enormously with handling COVID, because we wouldn't have had to go through all the procedure. For example, in the US, we have Congress has to vote for special appropriations to put the funds into people's hands in order for them to be able to have access to certain types of medical care and so forth. And you have to subsidize hospitals, and you have to vote for that. Now, there's nothing wrong with voting for things, but those things should be basic. They should be things that we have automatically. And this is not, again, a left-wing idea. Hayek once said, we believe that everybody should have the means to have a satisfactory life. That should be a basic requirement. From there on, it's the jungle. Okay, but nevertheless, even he saw that we had to protect even the weakest members of society and make sure that they have the essential things. And capitalism, as it stands, doesn't do that. It doesn't make sense in the richest country in the world to have long lines of people waiting for food because their salaries have either temporarily disappeared or even permanently disappeared. So I think we have to, we'll have to mute into another system. Whether we call it capitalism or some modified form of capitalism doesn't matter. It's not the name that matters. It's the way in which the system works. And the system as it is not resilient. It's not in a nice equilibrium, as people would like to claim it is, and it never is. And so capitalism as it is not delivering the goods. And so we have to change it. Many people, wealthy people, owners of firms and so forth, recognize this and have started to say, well, maybe we should take some more care about our employees having a participation in what we decide, and not just say that they are just a cost. When Air France was faced with a demand for wage increases from members of its staff, they said, no, we can't afford this because this would increase our costs and diminish our competitiveness. But if you tell the people who work for a firm that they're just a cost, then these people are not going to be very happy. If you tell them they're participating in something and they are necessary to deliver what the firm produces, then that's very different. They should be part of this enterprise, not some sort of wicked cost which you have to diminish as far as you can. And if you have the possibility of shipping off the production or of whatever you do to somewhere else where wages are cheaper, that's not a very satisfactory system. And I think that's the sort of thing that we've been faced with, and we're going to have to change. And I think a lot of people recognize that.